The gray hangars of the Luftwaffe main test facility at Recklen stood as silent sentinels over the future of German aviation science in the sweltering July of 1944. On the wide concrete apron a machine sat that appeared fundamentally alien to the lean and predatory aesthetic of the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs surrounding it. This was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an American behemoth that the German pilots had nicknamed the Flying Milk Bottle, or more simply the Jug. It was a captured specimen, one of the few that had landed relatively intact in occupied territory after its pilot had become disoriented or suffered minor mechanical failure. To the German ground crews, the P-47 was a source of endless fascination and technical intimidation. Its sheer scale was the first thing that shocked them. While a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 weighed roughly 3 tons at takeoff, the Thunderbolt weighed nearly 8 tons. It was a massive slab of American industrial muscle powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine. Hans Werner Lerche, the premier test pilot for captured aircraft in the Luftwaffe, stepped onto the wing root of the American fighter and felt the solid, unyielding nature of its construction. His mission was to fly this machine against the best that the Reich had to offer, to find its weaknesses and to understand how the American 8th Air Force was using such a massive aircraft to systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe over the skies of Germany. When Lerche first settled into the cockpit of the P-47, he was struck by a sensation that few German pilots ever experienced during the war: a sense of profound space and comfort. The German fighters of the era were notoriously cramped. In a Bf 109, the pilot was literally shrink-wrapped into the airframe, his shoulders touching the sides of the fuselage and his head nearly brushing the canopy. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, felt like the bridge of a ship. The cockpit was wide, the seat was adjustable and padded, and the layout of the instruments was remarkably logical. The American engineers had designed a workspace for a human being, not just a housing for a pilot. Lerche noted the quality of the switchgear, the clarity of the dials, and the presence of a highly effective heating and ventilation system. To a pilot who spent hours at 30,000 feet where temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero, these were not luxuries but critical components of combat endurance. But as he began the complex startup sequence for the double Wasp engine, the technical sophistication of the machine began to reveal its true and terrifying nature. The heart of the P-47 was not just its engine but the massive General Electric turbo supercharger system that occupied nearly half of the rear fuselage. German aviation engines like the Daimler-Benz 605 relied on mechanically driven superchargers that were limited by the physical constraints of the engine's RPM. The American system, however, utilized the energy of the engine's exhaust gases to drive a turbine that could compress thin, high-altitude air with incredible efficiency. As Lerche taxied the heavy fighter to the edge of the Recklen runway, he could feel the immense weight of the machine through the wide-set landing gear. He applied the brakes, performed a final magneto-check, and then slowly advanced the throttle. The 18 cylinders of the Pratt & Whitney roared to life with a deep guttural resonance that shook the ground. As the turbocharger began to spool up, the manifold pressure gauge climbed steadily and the Thunderbolt began its takeoff roll. Unlike the agile Messerschmitt, which leapt into the air, the P-47 required a long runway and a deliberate build-up of speed. But once the wheels left the ground and the gear retracted, the machine transformed into a high-speed aerodynamic battering ram. Hans Werner Lerche's flight notes, which were eventually presented to the Luftwaffe High Command, were filled with observations that shook the confidence of German tacticians. He discovered that the P-47 was not a fighter in the traditional European sense. It could not outturn a Bf 109 in a slow-speed dogfight, and its roll rate at low speeds was inferior to the Focke-Wulf 190. However, Lerche realized that these traditional metrics of aerial combat were becoming obsolete in the face of American tactics. The P-47 was an energy fighter. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, where the German engines began to struggle for breath, the Thunderbolt reigned supreme. The turbocharger allowed it to maintain its full horsepower while the German interceptors were choking on the thin air. Lerche noted with alarm that at 30,000 feet the P-47 could accelerate away from any German fighter with ease. But it was in the dive that the Thunderbolt became truly invincible. Because of its immense weight and clean aerodynamic lines, the P-47 could achieve speeds in a dive that would cause the wings of a German fighter to vibrate or fail structurally. Lerche recorded that if an American pilot had an altitude advantage, he was essentially untouchable. He could dive in, deliver a devastating burst of fire, and climb back to a safe altitude before the German pilot could even begin to bring his sights to bear. The armament of the P-47 was another source of shock for the German evaluators. Most German fighters carried a mix of 20mm or 30mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. While the cannons were powerful, they had a low rate of fire and limited ammunition. The Thunderbolt was armed with 850 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns, 4 in each wing. As Lerche tested the weapon system on the Rechlin firing range, he witnessed the devastating effect of this wall of lead. Each gun fired at a rate of 800 rounds per minute, meaning the P-47 could project over 100 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition per second. This was not a weapon of precision but a weapon of saturation. An American pilot did not need a perfect deflection shot, he only needed to get the German fighter in his general sights for a few seconds to shred the engine, the cooling system, or the pilot. Lerche noted that the 50 caliber rounds, while smaller than German cannon shells, had a flatter trajectory and a higher muzzle velocity, making them much easier to aim at high speeds. During his testing, Lerche engaged in simulated combat with a Focke-Wulf 190A8, the primary interceptor of the Luftwaffe. The results were sobering. The Focke-Wulf pilot, an experienced veteran of the Eastern Front, attempted to use his superior roll rate and maneuverability to get onto the tail of the captured Thunderbolt. Lerche simply pushed the throttle forward and initiated a shallow dive. Within seconds, the distance between the two aircraft widened to a point where the German pilot could no longer fire accurately. When the Focke-Wulf tried to follow the dive, the pilot reported that his controls became extremely heavy due to the buildup of aerodynamic pressure, while Lerche in the P-47 reported that his boosted controls remained relatively light and responsive. The realization was clear: the P-47 dictated the terms of the engagement. If it wanted to fight, it fought. If it wanted to leave, it left. This tactical autonomy was the nightmare of the German fighter arm. The most shocking realization for the Luftwaffe leadership came when Lerche analyzed the durability of the American fighter. He studied the internal structure of the P-47 and found that it was built with a level of redundancy that bordered on the obsessive. The radial engine was air-cooled, meaning it had no vulnerable radiator or coolant lines that could be severed by a single stray bullet, a fatal weakness of the liquid-cooled Messerschmitts. The double Wasp could continue to run even with several cylinders shot away. The airframe itself was built like a bridge with heavy main spars and thick skinning that could absorb hundreds of rounds of German machine gun fire without suffering a structural failure. Lerche famously remarked to his superiors that the P-47 was less like a traditional fighter and more like an aerial tank. He pointed out that while German industry was focusing on high-performance precision machines that were fragile and difficult to maintain, the Americans were mass-producing indestructible weapon systems that could be maintained by 18-year-old mechanics in a muddy field in England. This industrial disparity was the underlying message of Lerche's test flights. He observed that the P-47 was designed for mass production with standardized parts and a modular construction. Every component from the engine to the landing gear was designed for reliability and ease of replacement. In contrast, the German aircraft were becoming increasingly difficult to build and repair as the Allied bombing campaign began to grind down the Reich's industrial capacity. Lerche realized that even if the Luftwaffe could produce a fighter that was technically superior in a dogfight, they could never produce enough of them to counter the sheer volume of Thunderbolts arriving from across the Atlantic. The P-47 was the mechanical embodiment of the American way of war, a combination of high-technology industrial scale and unyielding logistical support. As Lerche continued his evaluations, he flew the P-47 to various frontline fighter wings known as Jagdgeschwaders to demonstrate the American fighter's capabilities to the pilots who had to face it every day. These visits were part of the Zirkis Rosarius, a specialized unit that toured the Reich with captured Allied aircraft. The reactions of the frontline pilots mirrored Lerche's own. They were stunned by the size of the machine and the power of its engine. Many of them had previously dismissed the Thunderbolt as a clumsy target, but after seeing Lerche perform high-speed passes and vertical climbs, they began to understand why their casualties were mounting. He taught them that they could never outdive a Jug and that they should never engage it in a high-altitude pursuit. He emphasized that the only chance a German pilot had was to catch the P-47 at low altitude and low speed, where its weight became a liability. But even then, he warned that the American pilot likely had 3 wingmen close by and 10,000 more Thunderbolts waiting back at base. The impact of the P-47 on the German war effort was not just tactical but strategic. By 1944, the Thunderbolt had been equipped with massive drop tanks, allowing it to escort American bombers deep into the heart of Germany. For the German interceptor pilots, this was the end of their air superiority. They no longer had a safe zone where they could assemble their formations before attacking the bombers. The Thunderbolts were everywhere. Lerche's testing proved that the P-47 could loiter at high altitude for hours waiting for the German fighters to take off. The moment a Messerschmitt retracted its gear and began its slow climb, it was vulnerable to a high-speed diving attack from a P-47 that had been watching from the clouds. The Luftwaffe was being strangled in its own nest, and the Thunderbolt was the primary instrument of that strangulation. In his final reports, Hans Werner Lerche was blunt about the technical superiority of the American aeronautical industry. He noted that the General Electric turbocharger was a masterpiece of metallurgy and engineering that Germany had failed to replicate in a reliable mass-produced form. He highlighted the efficiency of the American water methanol injection system, which allowed the P-47 to achieve emergency power ratings that could outpace any German fighter in a pinch. He also praised the visibility afforded by the bubble canopy of the later P-47D models, noting that the American pilot had a 360-degree field of view while the German pilot was still peering through a multi-framed greenhouse that created massive blind spots. Every detail of the P-47, from its powerful landing lights to its sophisticated radio equipment, pointed to a nation that had mastered the integration of man and machine for the purpose of total war. The shocking conclusion of the Luftwaffe's testing of the stolen P-47 was the realization that the air war over Europe was no longer a contest of individual pilot skill. It had become a war of systems, and the American system was simply better. The Thunderbolt was the ultimate expression of that system, a machine that combined overwhelming firepower, indestructible construction, and high-altitude performance in a package that was easy to fly and easy to maintain. Lerche's words to the Luftwaffe High Command were a warning that the Reich was facing an enemy that had perfected the industrialization of death. He saw in the P-47 the inevitable defeat of the German air arm, not because of a lack of courage among German pilots, but because of a fundamental failure of German technology and industry to keep pace with the American giant. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the eyes of its German captors remains one of the most significant technical studies of the Second World War. It stripped away the myths of German technological invincibility and revealed the cold, hard reality of American industrial power. When Hans Werner Lerche climbed out of the cockpit of the P-47 for the last time, he knew that the heavy metal beast he had just flown was the sound of a closing door. The Luftwaffe could test it, they could study it, and they could learn its secrets, but they could never stop it. The Thunderbolt would continue to thunder across the skies of Europe until the very end, its 850 caliber machine guns and its 2,000 horsepower engines serving as the relentless heartbeat of the Allied victory. The psychological impact on the German pilots who witnessed Lerche's demonstrations cannot be overstated. These were men who had been told they were the elite, who believed their machines were the best in the world. To see a captured enemy aircraft outperform their own fighters in so many critical categories was a devastating blow to their morale. They realized that the Americans were not just lucky or numerous, they were technically advanced in ways that Germany had not anticipated. The P-47 became a symbol of the impending collapse, a massive silver ghost that haunted the dreams of every Luftwaffe pilot. Even the legendary Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, recognized the significance of Lerche's findings. He saw that the P-47 and the P-51 Mustang had turned the German sky into a trap from which there was no escape. As the war entered its final months, the P-47 transitioned from a high-altitude escort to a low-altitude ground attack monster. Its durability, which Lerche had so highly praised, made it perfect for strafing German airfields, rail yards, and troop columns. The same 8 machine guns that had shredded German fighters now tore through panzer divisions and supply trains. The Thunderbolt's ability to absorb ground fire and still return home became a legend among American pilots and a nightmare for German soldiers. Lerche had predicted this versatility in his reports, noting that the machine's sheer power and ruggedness made it suitable for almost any combat role. The Jug had become the ultimate multipurpose weapon, an aerial sledgehammer that crushed everything in its path. The technical data gathered from the captured P-47 at Rechlin was shared with German aircraft designers at Messerschmitt and Junkers in a desperate attempt to improve their own designs. They looked at the American turbocharger and tried to adapt the technology for the Ta-152 and the Me-262. But the metallurgy required for the high-speed turbine blades was beyond Germany's reach, as they lacked the necessary supplies of nickel and chrome. They looked at the American wing design and the wide-track landing gear, but by the time they could implement any changes, their factories were being bombed into rubble. The Thunderbolt had arrived in Europe with a set of technical solutions that the Germans simply couldn't match in time. It was a failure of strategic foresight on the part of the German Air Ministry, which had initially prioritized short-range interceptors and failed to realize that the Americans would bring the fight to them at 30,000 feet. Hans Werner Lerche's experience with the P-47 remained a highlight of his career as a test pilot. He would go on to fly almost every major Allied aircraft captured by the Germans, including the B-17, the B-24, and the Spitfire. But it was always the Thunderbolt that he spoke of with the most respect. He recognized it as a singular achievement in aviation history, a machine that was perfectly suited for its time and its mission. His shock at its capabilities was a testament to the brilliance of Alexander Kartveli and the team at Republic Aviation, who had dared to build a fighter that was big, heavy, and incredibly powerful. They had ignored the conventional wisdom of the time, and in doing so they had created the most successful ground attack and escort fighter of the war. The story of the Luftwaffe testing the stolen P-47 is more than just a footnote of military history. It is a window into the moment when the tide of the war turned. It was the moment when the German military machine looked into a mirror and saw its own obsolescence. The words of Hans Werner Lerche and the data he collected served as a cold reminder that the war was being decided not just in the cockpits of the fighters but on the drafting boards of engineers and the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. The P-47 was the physical proof that the United States had not only the will but the technological and industrial capacity to win the war of the skies. When historians look back at the air war over Europe, they often focus on the Mustang because of its range and grace. But the Thunderbolt was the workhorse that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. It was the jug that absorbed the fire and kept moving forward, the machine that showed the German pilots that their finesse was no match for American force. The testing at Rechlin proved that the Americans had fundamentally understood the nature of modern aerial combat better than anyone else. They had built a machine that could survive mistakes, a machine that rewarded aggression, and a machine that embodied the overwhelming strength of a nation that refused to be defeated. The final report on the P-47 at Rechlin noted that the aircraft's high-altitude performance was its most dangerous attribute. The report stated that the German pilots must avoid combat at high altitudes at all costs and should instead try to lure the American fighters down into the denser air where the German fighters had a slight advantage. However, the report also noted that the American pilots were well aware of this and were increasingly disciplined about maintaining their altitude advantage. This was the ultimate tactical stalemate for the Luftwaffe. They could not win at high altitude, and they could not force the Americans to fight at low altitude. The P-47 had effectively neutralized the German fighter arm through a combination of technical superiority and disciplined tactical employment. As the Allied armies closed in on Rechlin in the spring of 1945, the captured P-47 was likely destroyed by the retreating German troops to prevent it from falling back into American hands. But the secrets it had revealed had already done their work. The Luftwaffe had been defeated, the German industry was in ruins, and the air war was over. Hans Werner Lerche would survive the war and eventually write about his experiences as a test pilot, providing a unique perspective on the machines that decided the fate of the world. His shock at the P-47 remained a defining moment of his war, a realization that the enemy was not just strong but technically superior in ways that were impossible to overcome. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, with its dual magnetos and complex fuel injection system, continued to power American aviation for decades after the war, a testament to its incredible design. The General Electric turbocharger technology pioneered in the P-47 became the foundation for the jet engines that would soon dominate the skies. The industrial principles used to build the Thunderbolt, mass production, standardization, and reliability, became the gold standard for global manufacturing. The P-47 was not just a fighter, it was a blueprint for the modern world. And for the German pilots who watched it fly at Rechlin, it was the terrifying sight of a future they could never reach. To the end, the P-47 remained a mystery to many of the German personnel who worked on it. They couldn't understand how a nation could afford to put so much material and so much technology into a single fighter. They were used to the scarcity of the Reich, where every scrap of metal and every drop of oil was precious. The American abundance was a shock to their system, a psychological weight that was just as heavy as the Thunderbolt itself. The Jug was the ultimate messenger of that abundance, carrying it into the heart of Germany at 400 miles per hour. It was a message that was heard in every explosion of its 8 machine guns and every roar of its 18 cylinders. Hans Werner Lerche's legacy as a test pilot is tied to these captured machines, but the P-47 holds a special place in the narrative. It was the machine that challenged his assumptions and forced him to re-evaluate what it meant to be a fighter pilot. He saw that the future belonged to the pilot who could master the complex systems of a machine like the Thunderbolt, the pilot who could manage the energy, the heat, and the power of a mechanical giant. The era of the dogfighting ace was being replaced by the era of the systems manager, and the P-47 was the first true example of that shift. The words of the German test pilot continue to resonate with historians today because they capture the raw, unfiltered reaction of an expert encountering a revolutionary technology. His shock was not the result of propaganda or fear, but of a deep professional understanding of aviation science. He saw the Thunderbolt for what it truly was: an irresistible force of nature that had been harnessed by American engineering. It was a machine that couldn't be explained away by simple numbers, a machine that had to be felt to be understood. And once Lerche felt the power of the jug, he knew that the war was already over. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains a towering figure in the history of the Second World War, a silver giant that patrolled the skies with an unyielding purpose. Its 8 tons of steel and its 2,000 horsepower engine are a reminder of a time when the world was decided by the strength of machines and the men who flew them. The testing at Rechlin was a brief moment of intersection where 2 different worlds met, and the result was a shocking realization that changed the course of the air war. The jug had arrived, and with it the inevitable end of the Luftwaffe. In the final analysis, the P-47 was the perfect weapon for the American strategy in Europe. It had the range to protect the bombers, the power to destroy the German fighters, and the durability to survive the ground attack missions that broke the German army. It was a machine that embodied the resilience and the ingenuity of a nation at war. The shock felt by Hans Werner Lerche and the Luftwaffe was the shock of a world being reshaped by a power they could not hope to match. The Thunderbolt would continue to fly in the memories of those who faced it, a massive, unstoppable force that had once been the master of the German sky. The meticulous records kept at Rechlin regarding the P-47's fuel consumption and maintenance requirements further highlighted the American logistical advantage. The German analysts were amazed that the Thunderbolt could carry enough fuel for a 6-hour mission and still have the performance to engage in high-intensity combat. They calculated the man-hours required to change an engine or a propeller and found that the American machine was designed to be kept in the air with a fraction of the effort required for a German fighter. This was the hidden strength of the jug, the ability to sustain a high operational tempo day after day, month after month. The Luftwaffe, already struggling with a lack of fuel and spare parts, could only watch in envy as the American formations grew larger and more aggressive. The story of the stolen P-47 also reveals the desperation of the German high command in the later stages of the war. They were willing to invest significant resources in capturing and testing enemy aircraft in the hopes of finding some secret, some weakness that would allow them to turn the tide. But the secrets they found in the Thunderbolt were not ones they could use. They found an industrial capacity they couldn't match, a technology they couldn't replicate, and a tactical doctrine they couldn't counter. The testing at Rechlin was an exercise in futility, a search for hope in a machine that offered only the certainty of defeat. When Lerche wrote his reports, he did so with the detachment of a scientist, but between the lines his admiration for the American fighter was clear. He saw the Thunderbolt as a pinnacle of engineering, a machine that had been built without compromise. He noted the quality of the plexiglass, the smoothness of the paint, and the precision of the flight controls. He saw that the Americans were not just throwing planes at the problem, they were throwing quality. The P-47 was a high-quality machine produced in high quantities, and that was the ultimate formula for victory. The shock felt by the Luftwaffe was the shock of realizing that they were being outclassed on every level of the technological and industrial spectrum. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, with its massive radial engine and its turbocharger plumbing, remains a masterpiece of utilitarian beauty. It was a machine that did its job with a brutal efficiency that was impossible to ignore. For the German pilots who faced it and the test pilots who flew it, the jug was the definitive aircraft of the air war. It was the machine that brought the war to their doorstep and showed them the true meaning of power. The testing at Rechlin remains a significant chapter in the story of the Thunderbolt, a moment when the enemy stood in awe of the machine that was destined to destroy them. Hans Werner Lerche's final flight in the P-47 was a solitary high-altitude mission over the heart of Germany. As he looked out from the bubble canopy at the landscape below, he must have seen the smoke from the bombed-out cities and the ruins of the industrial centers. He was flying the very machine that was causing that destruction, and he was doing so with a deep understanding of its power. He knew that the Thunderbolt was the future and that his own world was a thing of the past. The shock of that realization was the ultimate legacy of the stolen P-47, a machine that had crossed the lines to tell the truth to those who were brave enough to listen. The .850 caliber machine guns of the Thunderbolt continue to haunt the history books, their rhythmic fire the sound of an era. The 2,000 horsepower of the double Wasp engine remains the benchmark for the piston age. And the shock felt by Hans Werner Lerche at Rechlin remains the most honest assessment of the air war ever recorded. The Jug was more than just a plane, it was a force of history, and its thunder would be heard long after the war was over. The Luftwaffe had tested it, they had been shocked by it, and they had been defeated by it. There was nothing more to be said. As the years passed, Hans Werner Lerche often revisited his memories of the P-47. He reflected on the stability of the aircraft, its heavy controls, and the way it would settle onto the runway with a solid, authoritative thump. He remembered the smell of the American cockpit and the way the turbocharger would hum at high altitudes. He knew that he had been one of the few men in the world to experience the war from both sides of the cockpit, and the Thunderbolt remained his most significant memory. He had seen the future, and it was big, heavy, and painted in American silver. The final words of the report on the P-47 noted that the aircraft was a masterpiece of specialized engineering designed for a specific strategic mission, and that it had succeeded in that mission beyond all expectations. The report was a quiet admission of defeat, a recognition that the Luftwaffe had no answer for the Jug. The Thunderbolt would go down in history as the machine that won the air war, not through grace or agility but through force and precision. It was the flying tank, the milk bottle, the Jug, and to the German pilots who faced it, it was simply the end. The testing of the stolen P-47 at Rechlin remains a powerful story of technical investigation and historical realization. It is a story of how a single machine can change the way an entire military thinks about war. The shock felt by the Luftwaffe was the shock of reality crashing through the doors of propaganda. The Thunderbolt was the physical evidence that the war was being won in the factories and the design offices, and that the outcome was already decided. The Jug was the final word in the argument of the skies, and its voice was loud, clear, and terrifying. In the end, the P-47 was more than a fighter, it was a symbol of the American spirit in the Second World War. It was rugged, determined, and overwhelmingly powerful. The test pilots at Rechlin saw that spirit in every bolt and every rivet of the machine. They saw a nation that was willing to build a fighter that weighed 8 tons just to ensure that its pilots would return home. They saw a nation that would spare no expense and no effort to win. And that was the most shocking thing of all. The Jug was not just a plane, it was the United States in flight, and it was unstoppable. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt continues to inspire aviation enthusiasts and historians today. Its unique design and its incredible combat record make it one of the most important aircraft ever built. The story of its capture and testing by the Luftwaffe adds a layer of intrigue and technical depth to its history. It reminds us that the war was a clash of science as much as a clash of arms, and that the Thunderbolt was one of the greatest scientific achievements of the era. The shock felt by Hans Werner Lerche remains the ultimate tribute to the men who designed, built, and flew the Jug. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its massive radial engine and its sprawling turbocharger, remains a monument to the industrial might of the 20th century. It was a machine that brought the war to a close through its unyielding performance and its immense firepower. The testing at Rechlin was a brief and fascinating chapter in its long and storied life, a moment when the enemy had to stop and admire the weapon that was destroying them. The Jug was and will always be the king of the high-altitude skies, a silver giant that changed the world forever. The words of Hans Werner Lerche, his detailed notes, and his honest assessments provide a vital link to the past. They allow us to see the P-47 through the eyes of someone who truly understood its power. His shock was the honest reaction of a master pilot to a masterpiece of aviation engineering. It is a reminder that even in the heat of war there is room for professional respect and technical awe. The P-47 was a machine that demanded respect, and at Rechlin it got exactly that. The thunder of the P-47 may have faded from the skies, but its impact remains. It was the Jug that broke the back of the Luftwaffe, the machine that escorted the bombers and the weapon that strafed the ground. It was the ultimate expression of power and a symbol of victory. The testing at Rechlin was the moment the Luftwaffe realized that the thunder was for them. And as they watched the P-47 fly, they knew that the storm was coming and that there was no place left to hide. The Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine with its 18 cylinders continues to be a marvel of mechanical design. Its legacy lives on in the radial engines that still fly today and in the turbocharger technology that is now standard in many modern vehicles. The P-47 was a pioneer in so many ways, and its influence can still be felt in the world of aviation and engineering. The shock at Rechlin was the first realization of that influence, a moment when the world saw the future in the form of a heavy metal fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains one of the most iconic aircraft of all time, its massive presence a reminder of a pivotal moment in history. The story of its capture and the Luftwaffe's reaction to its technical superiority is a compelling narrative of military and industrial clash. It highlights the importance of innovation and the power of a well-designed machine. The Thunderbolt was the jug that couldn't be beat, and the words of Hans Werner Lerche are the ultimate proof of its legendary status. In the final reckoning, the P-47 was the aircraft that the Luftwaffe pilots feared the most. It wasn't because it was faster or more agile, but because it was inevitable. It was a machine that couldn't be stopped, a weapon that just kept coming. The shock at Rechlin was the shock of facing the inevitable. The jug was the end of the line for the Luftwaffe, and it did its job with a thunderous finality. The story of the stolen P-47 is the story of that end, a story of power, technology, and the shocking reality of war. The P-47 Thunderbolt will always be remembered as the aerial juggernaut of the Second World War. Its 8 machine guns and its 2,000 horsepower engine are the stuff of legend. The testing at Rechlin remains a fascinating episode in its history, a moment when the enemy stood in the shadow of the jug and felt its power. The words of the German test pilot are the final testament to its greatness, a shock that echoed through the Luftwaffe and into history itself. The jug was king, and the king had come to claim his throne.